Hi, welcome to Digging for Truth, presented by Associates for Biblical Research. I'm your host, Henry Smith. Today we're completing what is a 4-part episode on worldview structures and ideas influencing our culture today. I'm here with Josh Kline, my friend, and someone who spent years studying these topics. I hope that you've been fascinated with some of the ideas that we've been talking about, and you can see in our society how these ideas have affected what's happening around us. We encourage you to go back and watch the first 3 episodes if you're just tuning in here for the first time. And again, if you're new to watching Digging for Truth, please know that we're very interested in proclaiming the truth of the gospel and the truth of the Bible. That is the mission of the ABR ministry. Okay, so Josh, welcome back.
Good to be back.
We are back in the seat for episode number 4. Now, in our last episode, we talked about what's called critical theory. We kind of fleshed that out, of how that's rooted in Marxism. The conflict, Marxist classic was economic conflict. Here, critical theory, really oppressor and oppressed categories, puts humans in those 2 categories. We talked about its religious dimension. There's a quote you have here that this is just so powerful to show what's at stake when it comes to these ideas and the religious nature of them. Would you share it with us, please?
Sure. This is from an American social theorist named Jeremy Rifkin. He says, "We no longer feel ourselves to be guests in someone else's home, and therefore obliged to make our behavior conform with a set of pre-existing rules. We make the rules. We establish the parameters of reality. We create the world. And because we do, we no longer feel beholden to outside forces. We no longer have to justify our behavior. For we are now the architects of the universe. We are responsible for nothing outside ourselves, for we are the kingdom, the power, and the glory forever."
When you shared this with me, I always knew the religious nature of this conflict that's taking place and these ideas. And I knew it was ultimately about rebellion against God. Attempt to usurp him from his throne, as insane of an idea as that is. But here we have an explicit confession of faith. Okay, now not everyone out there who follows these ideas might express it this way, but I think you and I would agree this is really what it's all about. Maybe comment on that.
Yeah, I think he kind of gives the game away, right?
Yeah.
I think he's really saying what you're not supposed to say. Again, it goes right back to Karl Marx, that communism begins where atheism begins.
Yeah.
And so ultimately, like we said before, this is a rejection of the truth of the Bible and the way that God lays out how things should be. And we want to be the ones who make the world in our own image.
It's extraordinary. We are the architects of the universe. Imagine that.
Yeah.
We're
not guests in someone else's house.
Yeah, we're not guests in someone else's house. We make the rules, morality. We establish the parameters of reality. We talked about that in our previous episodes. Postmodernism, where the mind generates reality. Yep. God doesn't generate reality. I mean, on and on we could go. We want people to reflect on this, to understand what the battle is really all about. It's always about rebellion against God at the very bottom. Yep. And we need to understand that as Christians. We want to be compassionate and understanding towards unbelievers who are caught in the trap of these ideas. Yes. But we also have to acknowledge that without Christ, God is our enemy.
Yeah.
And that's really the truth of the matter at the bottom of it. And so that it's a war, a spiritual war. Okay, so that being said, this idea of critical theory has worked itself out now in particular ways as it relates to the issue of race. So we talked about the bigger picture of men and women, races, and all these different areas of oppressed, oppressor, but now particularly in critical race theory. Let's explore that together.
Right, because remember, in critical theory, the most important thing about you is your group membership.
Yes.
And so that's why you get all these studies, women's studies, the LGBTQ plus studies and whatnot, and race and all these things. So critical race theory is like a subset of critical theory. And according to critical race theory, the most important thing about you is your race. And so everyone's grouped according to being part of the oppressed group or the oppressor group, and that goes back to the Gramsci idea of the hegemony. Like we said, because we're both white males, we would naturally be part of this oppressor group just by virtue of being born, not that we had any choice in the matter at all. And this came out of Harvard University in the 70s. But the interesting thing about critical race theory is that it actually is against the ideas that were espoused in the civil rights movement. So you go back to the Martin Luther King Jr. speech, like that, you want your kids to be judged on the content of their character, not the color of their skin. Critical race theory is diametrically opposed to that. That the most important thing about you is the color of your skin. And going back to the postmodern thing, the idea is that the narrative is what's important and the felt reality of what it's like. So I can't empathize with somebody who is of a different nationality or different skin color than me because I haven't lived their life.
Right.
And so therefore I'm not qualified to speak about anything that has to do with their experience because simply I am the oppressor. And so the only way around this is essentially to spend my time trying to tear the system. Remember, it goes back to the system. To tear the system down because this whole system is a system that's based on these oppressive categories.
So again, back to what we mentioned in previous episodes, we think about a term like racism, and everyone would agree that that's a bad thing. But as soon as you examine the content of what that actually means, what you and I would mean is totally different than what these cultural forces would mean when they use this term, and that's in critical race theory.
Right. Well, actually, the critical race theory definition of things is the classical definition of racism. Because I don't see you as an individual, all I see is your
race.
Group membership.
Right.
So that's the irony of it.
It's its own form. It's its own form of racism. So let's talk. I want to talk about this one quote from a gentleman who advocates all of this. His last, Ibram X. Kendi. Let's look at this no neutrality in the racism struggle a comment that he makes. Now, there's a lot we could say about him, but we don't have time to develop our thought about that. But it's interesting how he categorizes people. Let's explore that a little bit.
Yeah, well, Kendi kind of creates a heads I win, tails you lose situation. So he says that the system is overtly oppressive. There's systematic oppression that's happening, systematic racism that's happening. And if you don't agree with that, well then that's because you're a racist. Right? And if you say that you're neutral and you don't see color, that's only because you're part of the class that's benefiting through this, and so therefore you're a racist. So unless you adopt his view and what he calls anti-racism, then essentially you want to keep the system and the status quo, so you're a racist.
And so the only way you can not be a racist is to advocate tearing the system down.
Right.
That's the argument he makes. He says here there's no neutrality in the racism struggle, and I just want to say this as a final word before we go to our break. Jesus says you're either with me or against me. Again, we see this religious component to these ideas. Right. You have to choose sides, almost like in an eschatological war that's taking place, right? And the reduction of people to these immutable attributes is the opposite of what we would want in the gospel, for sure. Well, friends, thank you for joining us for Digging for Truth. We'll be right back.
In a culture of intense Bible-denying skepticism, Associates for Biblical Research exists to strengthen followers of Jesus by affirming the authority of the Bible. Our archaeological fieldwork and original research form a strong foundation in upholding the reliability of the Scriptures. For students or anyone asking if they can really trust the Bible, please visit our website and partner with us by joining our prayer team or financially supporting this ministry. And thank you for standing with us.
Hi, welcome back to Digging for Truth. I'm Henry Smith. I'm here with Joshua Kline. We've been talking about worldview for the last 4 episodes and the influences on our modern culture. Okay, so let's return back a little bit to Kendi and what's so-called anti-racism. You had a few more comments you wanted to make about
I think it's interesting to note what Kendi says in terms of his religious views too, because he does talk about that. And he says that he believes in black liberation theology as opposed to white evangelical theology. And by white evangelical theology, he calls it savior theology. That, again, that there's something wrong with us and we need Jesus to come and save us from all our faults, instead of having Jesus be a revolutionary liberator to liberate us from all the oppression. So again, it's a fundamentally different view of the gospel than what most people espouse. And we said about even this false dichotomy, he says, and I quote from his book, "The only remedy to racist discrimination is anti-racist discrimination. The only remedy to past discrimination is present discrimination. The only remedy to present discrimination is future discrimination." So essentially, the only way around this is to discriminate against the discriminators, right? We have to oppress the oppressors. And so again, it leads to this, it's the fruit from the tree, right? What's the fruit? Is it peace and harmony, or is it this constant conflict, like this constant dialectic battle that's taking place?
Undergirded again by classical Marxism, and it has morphed its way up. I think that speaks for itself. And I just wonder about the savior theology, the idea that Jesus atones for the sins of people no matter who they are. You know, saying that this is a white construct. Just think about somebody like I don't know, Augustine. Is he in that category, since he lived in North Africa and probably had middle to dark skin? We don't know what he looked like. So there'd be an example of the absurdity of this whole idea that somehow this is a construct of the West when the gospel existed long before that. All right, so we want to shift, again, we're talking about religious components here, Josh. We've mentioned Black Lives Matter before. There was one dimension of it that you wanted to emphasize as well, and that is, again, the spiritual aspect. Let's talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, there's a lot of things. If you just do a little research on the internet, you could find out all kinds of interesting things about Black Lives Matter.org, the institution. And you mentioned some of the things that they listed on their website. But they also openly acknowledge practicing witchcraft. They talk about becoming intimately acquainted with spirits that they call on regularly and invoking the names of spirits. That whole idea of saying someone's name, that they're invoking this spirit. And the one person said, "I started to feel personally connected." This is Patrisse Cullors, who's probably the most well-known of the originators of the Black Lives Matter movement. She said, "I became personally connected and responsible and accountable to them, to both these spirits she's been talking about, both from a deeply political place, but also from a deeply spiritual place." And she talks about the Black Lives Matter movement as not just being a social movement, but a spiritual movement. And so again, it goes right back to what we've been saying, that there's more to this than meets the eye.
Yeah. So your counsel to the average Christian would be test everything.
Right.
So when you see organizations like this making claims, any organization, doesn't matter who it is, investigate it.
Yeah.
And here you find out, and we know from the Bible that God forbids this kind of thing. This is dangerous behavior, like dealing with the dead is not only evil in itself, it is dangerous because a person is playing with spiritual deception. And so, again, it goes back to this religious component. Okay, now another big term that we need to discuss that comes into play in all this is the term, again, we're going to define this well, hopefully, and that has to do with the term justice, or in this case, the term that's bandied about, social justice. Tell us your thoughts on it.
Right, so social justice is sort of the end goal of all of this. So you say, like, well, what does Marxism and all the critical theory and postmodernism, like, where are they all leading towards? And they're all leading towards this idea of social justice. Now, when we think of justice, usually we think of what's called retributive justice, where we talk about punishing or rewarding an individual. Again, it goes back to the individual based on the choices that they've made. But usually when they're talking about social justice, they're talking about distributive justice. And the key term here in all of this is equity. That in social justice, all things will be equitable. And I think we have to, here, it's helpful to distinguish between equality and equity. Yes. So equality, I would say, would be equal opportunity. Right. But equity has to do with equal outcomes. And so there's a fundamental difference there. And I think that we could illustrate this easily by talking about in academics, right? If we had a class and we gave a test, and I put the test scores on the board after we're all done, and I said to the people, okay, you have a choice of either taking the grade that you earned on the test or taking the class average. But it's going to be democratic socialism, so we're going to vote on it. Now, if more people scored below the average than above the average, then the class is probably going to vote to take the class average. Again, self-interest is the motivator here, right? Yes. So they're going to vote for that. But then here's the question. What happens on the next test if we keep the same policy where I'm going to just give everybody the class average? Will the grade stay the same? Will it go up or will it go down?
Yeah, the predictor is they're going to go down.
And it's going to go down because the people who studied are going to say, I don't need to study. I got the class average anyway. And the people who did a little bit won't do anything at all. And so you end up at this kind of lowest common denominator. And that's the part about all of this that I think is deceptive. Like, I have an equation that I often use, and it says freedom equals equity. And I'll ask people, do you agree with that? Freedom equals equity. Or I'm sorry, I should say that again. Freedom equals inequity is the way I mean. And people will say, well, no, I don't agree with that. And I say, think about this. What's the only way that I could make sure that everybody has equal outcomes? I have to take their choice away, right?
Yeah, you have to use force.
Right, and that's true in every aspect of our life, whether it's like financially or educationally. Like, everybody starts at the same place, but not everybody ends up at the same place. And is that because of the system? Or is that because of the choices that we make?
Yes.
So we want to have a system where everybody has the same opportunity. We would agree, we would promote equality.
Right.
But social justice is primarily focused on equity.
Flattening out.
Yes. And again, that goes back to the John Dewey thing and everything we've talked about, where we want the collective group to all be the same.
And a couple things just to add before we go to break is just how disturbing this is, really, because this idea has been tried. For example, in the Ukraine and the Soviet Union in the 1930s, and 5 million people starved to death when they decided to flatten equity out. So when it's taken to its logical extreme, it has to be done by force, ultimately. Yeah. So we have that catastrophe that happened. That was the natural outworking of that. The other part is, how do you weigh equity? It's not just, it reduces human beings to an economic transaction. What about joy and love and peace? You know, the career that I choose, right? I'm not doing this to make more money. I'm not just an economic transaction. I'm a complex image bearer. This dehumanizes people in a terrible way. And I think we ought to repudiate it and oppose it as much as we can. All right, folks, we are headed towards our last segment with Josh Kline. It has been a tour de force. We hope you come back for this final segment. We're going to try to wrap it up the best we can. Thank you for being with us.
Bible in Spade is a non-technical quarterly publication published by the Associates for Biblical Research. Written from a scholarly and conservative viewpoint, Bible in Spade supports the inerrancy of the biblical record and is a must-read for both the serious Bible student and anyone asking if they can really trust the Bible. Archaeological evidence, properly interpreted, upholding the history of the Bible. Subscribe today at BibleArchaeology.org.
Digging for Truth is produced and recorded in the studios of Lighthouse TV, positively different television.
Hi, welcome back to Digging for Truth. Thank you for joining us on this 4-part worldview journey, which we're finishing up here with Josh Kline. Okay, Josh, social justice. Talked about it really being trying to make outcomes equitable, equal, which has had terrible catastrophic consequences historically. Let's again talk about the religious dimension of it.
Yes. This is a quote from an essayist named Andrew Sullivan. He says, ideological social justice is perhaps best understood as a postmodern religious alternative, a successor ideology to Christianity. And he goes on to say that for many, especially the young, discovering a new meaning for life is thrilling. So the idea that you have a new goal to fight for, like that, and that's why, again, I think this is so ingenious, demonically ingenious, but you're giving people something that they think is good. We want everybody to be equal. Although, like, there's a myriad reasons why people aren't we want equity, right? The people don't end up equitable because of the decisions that they make, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. But from the goal of social justice, it gives somebody like a noble goal to be fighting for. We want to lift up the oppressed. We want to do all these things. But as we've shown, this is a religion that's antithetical to Christianity. It's antithetical to God. It sees everybody as oppressed or oppressor, and ultimately the end goal is to liberate mankind from all oppression. And who's the ultimate oppressor, like we said?
Yeah,
God is the ultimate oppressor.
It's interesting too here. This I think of the Westminster Catechism. What is the chief end of man? Social justice.
Yes.
Instead of the glory of God. Right. That seems to me to be what Sullivan is expressing here. Okay. So as we go through this final segment here, Josh, we thought, you and I thought it would be good to sort of summarize some of the basic questions about worldview and how we juxtapose all this matrix of worldview versus the biblical worldview and how they conflict with each other. So let's start with what is ultimately real.
Right. So from the ideological social justice point of view, the human mind ultimately is the thing that decides what is reality. Remember, we talked about postmodernism. But from the biblical worldview, God created the heavens and the earth, and He created everything in it, and us, and our mind. And so He is the arbiter of truth.
So we are not the architects of the universe.
So we don't create anything.
Yeah. So now the next question is, who are we? Who are we? This is a fundamental worldview question that every human being has to grapple with.
Right. So from the social justice point of view, we are determined by our group. Right. We're members of a group, and we're either oppressed or the oppressor group. And that's why it's fascinating to me. You know, like these people base their whole identity on their sexual preference. Like that's who they become. They become their sexual identity or their racial identity and stuff, instead of being the individual that they are. And so that replaces what the biblical worldview is, which we are creations of and image bearers of God, that we are uniquely created by Him. We're not a mistake. God didn't make any mistakes. And so it's the individual versus the group. Are we created in God's image? Again, there's all kinds of things that cascade out of that, like rights and all the stuff that we've talked about already.
Excellent. Okay, so we talked about this in the first segment, but it bears repeating here. What is our fundamental problem as human beings?
So from the social justice point of view, the fundamental problem is oppression. If we could get rid of the oppressors, then we could maybe attain this utopia that we have. But again, the problem is when you dethrone the oppressors, do you become the new oppressors? And is it just a cycle of oppression what's the culmination? Where's the redemption at? But from the biblical point of view, sin is the problem.
Yes.
It's that G.K. Chesterton quote that's often attributed to him, like, what's the problem today in the world? I am. Yes.
And that is personal responsibility as well. Okay, so the solution to the problem in the social justice construct and the biblical worldview.
So social justice construct is revolution. It's to tear down the hegemony. We need to tear the system down and create it in our own image, whatever that may be. And in some regards, some of these people that you read, it's just a continual process of revolution. It never ends.
It never ends, right.
But from the biblical point of view, it's the gospel, right? The solution is that we are guilty before a holy and righteous God, and that there is nothing that I can do to reach His minimum level of moral accountability, which is perfection, right? I can't. God's minimum level that we must attain to satisfy a holy and righteous God is to be morally perfect. Think about it. Like you take a test, you get one answer wrong. There's no extra credit, right? There's not, like, you'll never get back up to that standard.
Right.
So I'm hopeless unless, like it was Anselm who said that the debt was so great that while none but man must solve the debt, none but God was able to do it, so that he who does it must be both God and man. And so that's Jesus came down. He was truly human, truly God, fulfilled God's minimum requirements for us, and then offered Himself as a sacrifice for me so that I could then be just before a holy, righteous God. My judgment has been paid.
Excellent. Well, Josh, thanks for being on the show. Thank you for all that you do. Thank you for the hard work you've put in. Thank you for being committed to the gospel. It's a pleasure to be your friend. It's a pleasure to have you here, and I consider it a joy that we were able to do this together.
Yes, I appreciate it. It's been fun. Thank you.
Well, friends, you heard Josh's presentation of the gospel. We need Jesus to redeem us, not the work of men and not ideologies that actually serve to destroy human well-being and undermine and are ultimately in rebellion against God. We hope that this journey, as complex as it's been at points, has been edifying to you. We ask that you would pray that these ideas would be purged from your mind and that you would have the mind of Christ deposited in the Scriptures and in the Gospels and His holy word. We thank you for joining us for Digging for Truth. Have a great day.